Hello guys, so right before we get into the stories, I want to say that I'm trying to reach 100 subscribers, so I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe. Also, this is my first ever video, so it would be nice if you guys could tell me in the comments what I should change about my videos. Alright then, let's get into the first story. A hiker decided to go on a hike by himself, something he was not very used to. The whole day was normal. Trees and bushes engulfed his surroundings. He enjoyed being outdoors in the mountains. Nothing seemed strange to him, that was until he was making his way back to his car. He figured an 8-hour hike was good enough. The sky was already getting dark, and he needed to get back fast. What was odd was how much he didn't recognize the trail back. He began to panic. Night had already taken over, and all he had was a flashlight and no clue on how to get back. He knew it was already too late and too dangerous to keep going through the perilous forest. He began to worry that he would have no shelter for the night when, almost luckily enough, he stumbled across a broken-down cabin. It was dark and seemed like no one had visited it in years, but he knew it was the only place where he could rest until daylight, especially since his flashlight was running out of battery. He knocked on the door a few times, but no one answered, so he let himself in where, strangely enough, a perfect bed fitted for one person awaited him in the center. He knew that if the owner came back, he could explain himself. He was sure that the owner wouldn't mind, or was even probably dead. So he went ahead and got himself comfortable in bed. As he tried to sleep, he couldn't ignore the collection of paintings around the room. Portraits of strange-looking people all peering at him, each wearing a smile that sent chills up his spine. Not too long after his exhaustion from the hike got the best of him, and he was able to ignore the faces. The next morning, he got up early and was shocked to see that there were no paintings around the room, but windows. Sarah had always been drawn to old, forgotten places. When she found the abandoned house at the edge of town, shrouded in vines and dust, she felt an inexplicable pull to explore it. The house had stood empty for decades. Local legend said it was haunted, but Sarah was a skeptic. The idea of ghosts never bothered her. It was the unknown that intrigued her most. The house was massive, with towering windows, a grand staircase, and long, creaking hallways. Despite the years of neglect, the air inside felt strangely alive, as if the house itself was waiting for something or someone. She wandered through the darkened rooms, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The furniture was old, draped in sheets untouched for decades, but it was in the parlor that she first heard the whispers. Soft at first, like the wind brushing through cracks in the walls. But as she stood still, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't in any language she recognized, but they felt urgent. "Get out!" The words seemed to slither around her, chilling her to the bone. Sarah froze. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling, though she tried to sound brave. Nothing answered, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from every direction, crawling under her skin. "Leave! Now!" She turned to run, but the floor beneath her seemed to shift, the hallway stretching out impossibly long, as if the house was bending and reshaping itself to trap her. Panic surged in her chest as she realized the way she had come in was no longer visible. The front door had disappeared, replaced by more walls. The whispers turned into giggles, high-pitched, childlike. The sound reverberated in the dark corners of the house, growing louder, swirling around her like a storm. Then she saw them. At the end of the hallway, shadows moved. At first, they were barely visible, like the outline of people standing still. But then they began to shift, taking form. Tall, thin figures, their faces obscured by dark hoods. Their hands were long, bony, and reaching toward her. She couldn't make out their features, but the coldness of their presence was undeniable. They were not human. "Help! Me!" The voice was faint but unmistakable. It came from the shadows, yet Sarah could feel it inside her head. The voice was pleading, desperate. "Please, they'll take you too." She wanted to run, but her feet were frozen to the ground. The air around her grew thick with an oppressive weight. Her vision began to blur as the figures drew closer, their dark forms moving like smoke, winding through the air, closing in on her. Then from the corner of her eye, she saw someone standing at the far end of the hall. A figure hunched over, its back to her, Its long hair cascaded in front of its face, and it wore tattered clothes that blended into the darkness. But what struck her most was the way it moved. Slow, deliberate, like it was waiting for her to notice it. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. Silence filled the air. Without thinking, Sarah bolted down the hallway, racing toward the figure, thinking that maybe, just maybe, it was someone who could help. As she approached, the figure turned. Its face, if you could call it a face, was a hollow, empty void. Black, inky holes where eyes should be, a mouth frozen open in a silent scream. It wasn't a person, it was something far worse. She stumbled back, her chest tightening, the room spinning. Her flashlight flickered and went out, leaving her in total darkness. The whispers began again, louder now, more frantic. "She's here! She's here!" Something brushed against her arm, cold, wet, like the touch of 1,000 hands, all reaching, pulling her back toward the shadows. She screamed, her voice strangled with terror, but it was drowned out by the rising cacophony of voices, hundreds of them, echoing through the house. She felt herself being dragged into the dark, her feet barely touching the ground, her vision flashing from one nightmare to the next. And then, the house fell silent. The darkness was thick. The whispers stopped. The cold grip loosened. And for a brief, terrifying moment, she thought she had escaped. But when her vision cleared, she realized something even worse. She wasn't alone anymore. Standing in front of her was a woman, pale, gaunt, her face hollow like the figure she'd seen earlier. Her mouth opened wide in a grin, and Sarah could see her own reflection in the woman's eyes. "I was waiting for you," the woman said, her voice a cold rasp. "You're one of us now." Before Sarah could scream, she felt her body go rigid, like her muscles had turned to stone. And then, all at once, she was falling into the blackness. But when she opened her eyes, she was standing in the hallway once more, the whispers now just a distant hum. The house seemed normal again, as if nothing had happened. She turned toward the door, but the shadows on the walls weren't moving anymore. They were watching her. The hallway stretched before her, but there was something different now. She was standing in the house, but she wasn't alone. The house had claimed her. And as she turned to flee, she saw the dark shapes of other figures, each standing at the ends of the hallways, their faces hollow, waiting. She had become one of them. And now she, too, would whisper for the next victim to come in. As Sarah looked at her reflection in the mirror, she realized she was no longer herself. Her features were wrong, distorted. It wasn't her body, but the same hollow, smiling face of the figure that had greeted her. The whispers grew louder in her mind, her own voice now mingling with the others, trapped in the house forever. The house had never been haunted by ghosts. It was the souls of the living, those who entered but never left. And now it was her turn to play the part of the whispering thing. Maggie had always loved the old farmhouse her grandparents had left her. Nestled at the edge of a small town, the house was crumbling with age. But it had a charm to it, a place that smelled of old wood, dust, and memories. She'd spent many summer afternoons there as a child, and now, after years of city life, she was eager to return and breathe in the calm of the country. When Maggie arrived, she found the house in worse condition than she'd remembered. The roof sagged, the paint had peeled, and the windows were coated with grime. Yet, despite the dilapidation, she felt a strange sense of peace. It was quiet, too quiet almost. She began cleaning the rooms, sweeping away dust and cobwebs, finding remnants of a time long past. But it was the walls that caught her attention. The house was strange in its construction. There were certain spots near the kitchen, along the staircase, and especially in the hallway upstairs, that seemed to be too thin. Maggie could hear a soft sound if she put her ear close, like a faint tapping or scratching. It wasn't the house settling, but something else, something that didn't belong. One night, unable to sleep, Maggie decided to investigate. The sound was more distinct now, tapping like tiny nails on wood. She followed it to the hallway. There, near a section of the wall she had never noticed before, the tapping grew louder. Her pulse quickened as she ran her fingers along the plaster. It was cold to the touch, and the sensation sent a chill down her spine. She pressed harder, and there was a slight give, like the wall was thinner here than it should be. Maggie found a small crack at the edge of the wall, and with a growing sense of dread, pried it open. Inside, there was a small, narrow space, too small for an adult to crawl through, but large enough to hide something. And that's when she heard it, a child's giggle, soft and breathy, like it was coming from right behind her. She froze, heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she turned around. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the giggle echoed again, closer this time, as if it was inside the walls with her. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she pulled at the crack in the wall, determined to see what was inside. With a final tug, a section of the plaster crumbled, revealing a small, cramped cavity. She gasped when she saw it, a child's drawing, crudely scratched into the wood beneath. A figure, just a stick figure with large, hollow eyes, was etched into the grain, its arms outstretched, reaching. The giggling stopped. Suddenly, the temperature in the hallway plummeted. Maggie could see her breath clouding in the air. A whisper, soft at first, then growing louder, filled her ears. "Help me! Help me!" It sounded like a child's voice, but there was something wrong with it. Something unnatural in the way it seemed to slither into her mind, making her stomach churn with a deep, instinctive fear. Maggie's hands trembled as she reached deeper into the cavity, her fingers brushing against something soft. She pulled it out, a small, frayed doll. It was old, its face stitched with uneven black thread that made its eyes appear to be constantly staring, empty and unblinking. The doll felt unnaturally cold to the touch. "Please, help me." The voice was louder now, right next to her ear. Maggie spun around, her eyes wild, but there was no one there. The walls seemed to close in around her. The air grew thick with the feeling of something, someone watching. The scratching noise started again, only now it was not just in the walls, but under the floorboards, in the ceiling, everywhere. It was as though the entire house was alive with movement. Desperate to leave, Maggie stumbled backward toward the stairs. But when she reached the bottom, she saw something that stopped her dead in her tracks. There at the foot of the stairs was the doll. It was no longer in her hands. It was standing upright, its cold, empty eyes locked onto her. And in its tiny, stitched mouth, a voice whispered, "You should never have come back." Maggie's breath hitched as the giggling returned, louder now, filling every corner of the house. But it wasn't just one child's giggle. It was hundreds, thousands. The sound echoed from every crevice, bouncing off the walls and ceiling. Panic surged through Maggie's veins. She rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. It felt as though something on the other side was holding it shut, preventing her from escaping. Then from the corner of her eye, she saw movement in the shadows. Figures, small, hunched, crawling along the walls. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but their eyes were wide, hollow, and staring. They were watching her. The whispers grew into a chorus, now almost deafening. "You shouldn't have come back. You shouldn't have come back." The figures began to move closer, climbing down the walls, their bodies jerking unnaturally, as though they were made of broken things stitched together in the dark. Maggie could feel the cold breath of one as it reached out, its hands long and twisted, its nails sharp. "Help me!" The voice was unmistakable now. It was no longer coming from the walls or the doll. It was coming from the thing that was standing right behind her. Maggie didn't dare turn around. She knew what would be waiting, and then, just as the hands were about to grab her, the door burst open, and she tumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The house behind her seemed to groan, the whispers slowly fading, but the giggling that never stopped. Maggie ran, but she never returned to the farmhouse. She left everything behind, her family's legacy, the house, the memories. But sometimes on quiet nights, she can hear it, a child's giggle, coming from the walls. And when she closes her eyes, she sees them, staring back at her. The children, the ones who were never meant to leave. A few months later, Maggie stood before the farmhouse once more, unable to shake the feeling of something unfinished, like a loose thread pulling her back. Despite everything, she decided to go inside one last time, to face whatever it was that had haunted her. She crossed the threshold cautiously, the house as silent and still as ever. There was no sound, no whispers, no giggling, just an overwhelming feeling of being watched. Maggie slowly climbed the stairs, drawn to the spot where she'd found the cavity in the wall. The cracks in the plaster had been hastily covered over, as if someone had tried to hide them. But Maggie knew better. She tore at the wall again, her heart pounding as the plaster crumbled away. Behind it, there was nothing. Nothing but the hollow space. She reached into it, her fingers brushing something cold. A small, crumpled photograph. It was a picture of her family, of Maggie as a little girl, standing with her parents and grandparents, smiling at the camera. But there was something wrong about it. In the background, barely visible, was a small, shadowy figure, standing in the doorway, watching her. Maggie stared at the figure, her breath catching in her throat. It was her, but it wasn't her. The figure in the photo was not smiling. Its face was twisted in an expression of hollow emptiness, its eyes dark and unblinking. The realization hit her like a wave. The house hadn't been waiting for her to return. It had been waiting for the thing that had taken her place years ago.